Hello, my fellow documentarians. My name is Kenzie Woodbridge. My pronouns are they and them. I want to start today by gratefully acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the Pacific coast of Canada, where I live, work, and learn on the traditional unceded territory of the Musqueam and Tsleil-Waututh Indigenous peoples. I am excited to be talking to you today about three of my favorite things: people, obscure academic theory, and technical documentation. So here's my plan. First, context is always important. I'll explain a little about where I work so you can understand where I'm coming from. Then I'll define what I'm including when I talk about documentation. I'll offer up a few caricatures of some of the folks you might find in any technical organization. I will also introduce you to player type theory and talk just a little bit about the history of online games, where it comes from. And then I'll try and connect that theory back to those folks that I introduced you to and documentation. And I'll finish up by identifying some of the challenges and offering some possible solutions and strategies that this application of the theory suggests. Also, even though I'm not in the room to hear it, something that I deeply regret, I hope to make you laugh if I can, because we all need a bit of levity these days. So context is important. In addition to my primary career, which I'll tell you about in a moment, I'm also a communication scholar and researcher. And in my field, we talk an awful lot about context and the way it brings meaning to things. So that's why I'm bringing it in here. In my primary career, I work in IT services at the British Columbia Institute of Technology. Every year, our faculty and staff support and teach programs like nursing, accounting, computer systems, aviation, carpentry, forestry, radio and television broadcasting, and many, many more to just under 50,000 students. As IT workers, we have a lot of users to support. We have a lot of technical needs to meet, and we have a lot of complexity to navigate. Over the last 16 years at BCIT, I have worn and continue to wear many hats. I've done a lot of software user support. I continue to do plenty of technical training with our users. I work with developers to create and implement new tools and software for our users, bringing the user perspective in and helping design systems to meet their needs. I also do a surprising amount of meeting facilitation and conflict management. But most importantly, for this talk and like many of you, I write, edit, and just generally wrangle documentation. I work in a complex environment, and so I know firsthand how important it is to have documentation to help us all to navigate that complexity. And here's my bias. Docs are awesome. I'm really into documentation. So one last piece of context, I should also say that when I'm talking about documentation, I'm probably using a broader definition than you're used to. For me, and for this talk, the category of documentation includes developer and user documentation and manuals, knowledge bases, and so on, the things you probably expect. But it also may include things like code comments, embedded help, UI text, or decision logs and meeting minutes, requirements even. For our purposes today, it's all documentation. And documentation exists because it is created by people. So I'm going to start by sketching out a few personas that I feel you will know pretty well. Just a word of explanation around naming. When I was writing this talk, I realized that I didn't want to accidentally tie any of these personas or their characteristics to any particular ethnic group or gender or anything like that. So I decided to name my personae for cruciferous vegetables and use the singular they as the pronoun for each. Let's start with Brussels sprout, or Sprout for short. They are an experienced support desk person. Sprout loves their job because they enjoy helping people solve problems. They have a very good understanding of end users, including what users want to do and how well they can do it. Sprout has significant general technical skill, but they are often person-helping specialists rather than a technical specialist. I'm guessing that all of you know a few Sprouts, and perhaps some of you even are Sprouts. Then there's Turnip. Turnip could be any number of different technical specialists, but for this example, let's say that Turnip is a server administrator, probably Linux associated. Turnip loves knowledge, but Turnip does not like interacting with users. To Turnip, users exist to justify the existence and maintenance of servers. And my friend, oh, those servers, they are beautiful, even if we are maybe not all equipped to appreciate that beauty. Turnips can be a bit openly dismissive of people who can't understand what a server configuration means just by looking at it. If you're not going to spend the hours that Turnip has spent learning everything there is to know about this, you don't really deserve to have the information handed to you on a plate. Perhaps this sounds familiar? Then there's Kale. Kale is very popular these days. Somehow, if there are 15 projects on the go, Kale is always going to be right at the head of the most exciting and buzzwordy project. Kale is here to implement remote software delivery in 6 weeks. Going serverless, look no further than Kale. Kale is good at quickly acquiring the necessary skills to make something happen, but their understanding won't extend any deeper than it needs to get it done. Kale likes to win at IT. In service of that, they know how and when to schmooze, and they show up at meetings when important people are there. At the end of the project, their name is at the top of the incomplete list of deserving team members when the kudos get handed out in public. If Kale is on a project, that project must come in on time and on budget. Last but not least, broccoli. Being a broccoli, I suggest, is more of a lifestyle than a technical role. Broccoli can actually have any number of roles in your organization, though usually they have at least a little power. They could be a developer, project manager, server, or database administrator, support desk coordinator, etc. It's often hard to pin down exactly how technically skilled broccoli is, or what their availability is, or what they're actually responsible for. They may or may not be eager to get involved in projects, but if they are, at some point, when it can cause the most stress and anxiety to others, they become a weird, unaccountable bottleneck. Broccoli is great at engineering a situation so that they're causing the problem, but you're the one who will be blamed. I certainly hope that you don't have a broccoli in your workplace, but I'm guessing that most of us have encountered such a person in our careers at least once. Now, some of you might be sitting there saying, hold on there, you led us down a garden path with your talk description. This is all vegetables and stereotypes. I am here to see someone apply an outdated ludic research framework to documentation strategy. Never fear, my friends, we are doing this. From having given this talk previously, I know that if I were to ask in the room, many of you would already know what a MUD is, and a few of you would even have played one. But for those who don't know, MUD stands for Multi-User Dungeon. MUDs are text-only online multiplayer games. Richard Bartle and Roy Trubshaw created one of the very first MUDs in 1978, which happens to be the year that I was born. Their popularity likely peaked in the mid to late 90s, which is when I spent my time playing and creating in them, but there are still hundreds online and playable today. The MUD you see me inexpertly navigating here is actually a version of Bartle and Trubshaw's original MUD, called MUD 2. So what is player type theory? In 1996, Richard Bartle, who created the MUDs, published an article in which he described 4 types of players, differentiated by their motivations. He then expanded on this theory in this weighty tome in 2003. The easiest way to explain player types is to sketch out a simple combinatory table. We only need 2 axes. One axis I'll mark with interact at one end and act at the other. I find it helps to think of it as interact with and act on. The other axis has players at one end and world at the other. Then each of the 4 quadrants is a combination of 2 traits. So up at the top left, we have the combination of interact and players. These are the folks whom Bartle called socializers. They have fun by interacting, usually pleasantly, with other players in the game. They might play, but they're not playing to win or even to explore necessarily. It is the social interaction with other players that interests them. Then over here, we have interact and world. These are explorers. They have fun by gaining an in-depth knowledge of the game and its mechanics, the environment. Though they might have the hard-won skill to beat the game, that's not really interesting to them. Finding hidden things or understanding game mechanics well enough to exploit them for your own uses is. Down here, we have act and world. Bartle named these players achievers, and they have fun by acting on the game world and beating the game. They want to get to the highest level, beat all the quests, get the best armor, and so on. And then in the final quadrant, we have act and people, and Bartle, not one for mincing words, called these players killers. They have fun by acting on other players, often by disrupting their play, perhaps by killing their characters or destroying what they have built or collected. These four are Bartle's player types. And in his player type theory, Bartle posited both a number of interactions and dynamics that occur between players of various types and suggest ways to design a virtual world to encourage or discourage various types in hopes of finding a stable equilibrium of players in the game. Caveat time. Before I go on, just in case any of you were starting to get itchy at the idea that there are somehow only four types of people in the world, I just want to reassure you, this is obviously a simplistic model, and our identities and motivations are inherently unstable. Bartle himself suggests that players may have different motivations in different contexts or may progress through all four types over time. So don't worry, this isn't about trapping real people in permanent boxes. Now it's time for the fun part. We're going to take player type theory, which was developed in the context of game design, and apply it to technical documentation. Applying a theory in this way sometimes lets you find interesting congruences or receive new insights. It's a way of looking at things you know well from a new angle. And if you're a communication scholar, this is also the kind of thing you do for fun. Invite me to all of your parties, is what I'm saying. Now, when I was reading Bartle's work on player types, I noticed something. Although Bartle was writing about playing a game and the kind of things that motivate individuals to play it, he sure mentioned documentation an awful lot. And that's especially true when he talks about the difference between the top and bottom half of our combinatory on the world side. Interact with explorers versus act on achievers. Bartle talks a lot about the difference between a game that you're designing specifically to engage explorers versus one that you're designing to engage achievers. And for the most part, the difference between them relates to documentation of one kind or another. Here's a couple of examples, and these are right from his paper. So emphasizing interacting over acting means designing for explorers. And Bartle says to make the help facilities produce vague information and produce cryptic hints when players appear stuck. Emphasizing acting over interacting means designing for achievers, and Bartle suggests providing a game manual and including automap and autolog facilities. When I read this, it immediately struck me that this might offer a useful insight into a phenomenon that I frequently saw in my workplace. Perhaps you've seen this too. Not all of the time, but at least some of the time. Some of the most specialized and expert people are also the people who write the least documentation. This has always puzzled me. But if those deep dive specialists are motivated in their work by discovery, by figuring things out, then having proper documentation would actually take all the fun and enjoyment out of that for them. Doing a difficult thing is only an engaging task worthy of their skills and their attention if there isn't a walkthrough telling them each and every step along the way. They can work and even thrive in an environment with poor or no documentation because it's engaging and interesting. This made me start thinking about applying the model to my work environment. So let's go back to our combinatory again. I'm going to modify it just slightly for workplace application. I'm going to leave interact and act just as they are, but I'm going to swap out players for users, and then I'm going to swap out world for technology. Now let's bring back those personas I talked about a few minutes ago. You've probably already guessed from what I just said that I'm proposing that Turnip is an explorer because they like to interact with the technology and gain knowledge of it. Sprout, who enjoys interacting with users, is a socializer. Kale, then, with their love of winning, is an achiever. And yep, that makes Broccoli, the gatekeeper and weird subtle power player of the group, a killer. So what does the schema mean for technical documentation? Well, we all can and should participate in documenting at least some of the things we know because it makes our own work and the work of our colleagues and clients easier and more efficient. But how can we make that happen? Let's get into the meat of this talk. Let's take a tour back through our cruciferous characters and talk about how each of the types is likely to approach documentation and what challenges that might create. Then I'm going to highlight some strategies suggested by player type theory that have worked for me. Sprout first. So I'm going to suggest to you that since Sprout's focus is on users and meeting user needs, the Sprouts of the world actually often love documentation because it helps them to solve a user's problems quickly and without missteps. They can send a user to a resource that lets them do self-help, or they can step through it with them in person or on the phone. Documentation also helps Sprouts to maintain their broad technical experience and knowledge, and they tend to give back to it. As a support desk worker in a team, Sprout also often wants to support their colleagues in solving user problems. If, for example, Sprout figures out a workaround that isn't documented, they will document it. In fact, in my experience, Sprout is a natural documenter. And if Sprout is working in a place without a central documentation repository, or if they are prevented from easily contributing to it, they will be the person with 40 Word documents on their desktop that they can quickly email to a user in need. Here's the challenge. Despite their expertise and knowledge, Sprouts are often undervalued and sit low in the IT workplace hierarchy. I have a bunch of personal theories about this, specifically to do with the way they are perceived to be tainted by their interaction with and concern for the inconvenient non-technical user. So I want to note that in player type theory, Bartle sees socializers as critical elements in a stable game community. He notes that without sufficient socializers in the community, a game's player base will inevitably dwindle. That's because within a game environment, socializers provide an appreciative and companionable audience for explorers and achievers, and reactive prey for killers, which is an uncomfortable thought. In a tech environment, Sprouts can have even more impact. In addition to producing their own documentation focused on the actual needs of the actual users they have contact with, they are appreciative users, testers, and communicators of any documentation that their more tech-specialized colleagues produce. Sprouts are important and even pivotal contributors, so we should take seriously the problem of their marginalization in our organizations and possible targeting by the killers or broccolis of the world. It's worth pointing out that a work environment isn't the same as a game environment. Workers have less freedom to just physically leave if they're bored or harassed, but they can certainly disengage, stop going the extra mile, and doing things like writing and maintaining documentation. So how can you help? I suggest a two-front approach: structural support and cultural support. Under structural support, all of my suggestions actually apply to every type to a greater or lesser degree. First, I suggest that you can never go wrong with a structured template. Nothing aggressively and intimidatingly stares down a potential documenter like a completely blank document. I actually have more to say about templates, but I'll come back to that in a minute. Second, provide a place for the docs to live that is integrated with the rest of the documentation. Adopt my broad definition of documentation and keep it all together in an organized way. Finally, I suggest that some non-judgmental assistance with editing and publishing could be useful. If you're lucky enough to have a specialist writer or KB administrator, like me, like many of you, if you're on that team, then that kind of support is just a natural part of the role. But in addition to that, a buddy system could be a good strategy, or social group documentation sprints and those sorts of things, with the culture of folks being a second reader for each other. You also need to try to change the culture of your organization. Use whatever influence you have to advocate for Sprouts and make sure that they are being included where they're being needlessly excluded. If you're in a project meeting and there's never anyone there who supports users in using the thing you're building, ask why not. Ask it often. Get Sprouts in the room because they know things that developers and administrators and project managers don't know. Better than being reactive, of course, is anticipating when there could be opportunities for Sprouts to be involved and then make it happen. And finally, become the local Sprout ambassador. Don't let anyone speak ill or be dismissive of a Sprout in your presence. Talk about the good work they do, the documentation they write, their expertise and knowledge of users, their user empathy, etc. Thank them for the work they do publicly in front of others. Basically, what I'm saying is that if you care about documentation, Sprouts are your natural allies. And if they're being dismissed, forgotten, excluded, or discounted, your documentation is going to be worse, your workplace culture will be less engaging and enjoyable, and supporting your user community is going to be a lot harder. Oh, Turnip. As an explorer, Turnip is motivated by knowledge and likes to have the freedom to explore and figure things out for themselves. Learning and exploring are so central to a Turnip's motivations that they have difficulty imagining that this isn't true of everyone else. Something that I've heard a lot from the Turnips I work with, whom I love, is that they don't want to tell users best practices or guidelines for how to use a tool because the tool is flexible or intuitive, and users should just spend a bit of time exploring it and figuring out how they want to use it. They appear baffled by users who just want to briefly use technology to accomplish a specific task and then move on to the next thing on their list. Then too, Turnip's deep technical experience and knowledge and their respect and reverence for same can also introduce tension in the workplace when differences in skill level are likely to be common. In my experience, Turnips tend to be quick to judge others against their own expectations. This means that for turnips, folks who lack experience and knowledge of technology or who aren't interested in exploring the technology for themselves aren't busy people who may be experts in their own domain and who just have a lot of work to get through in a day. They are wildly inferior turnips, and surely no amount of documentation will help with that. What it comes down to is that turnips are natural anti-documenters. It doesn't naturally occur to them to write it, and if they document something, it is likely to be reminiscent of the quote I showed you previously, cryptic hints that only another similarly skilled turnip could parse. And when that doesn't appear to stop people asking them inconvenient and annoying questions, they may just throw up their hands and give up on documentation entirely. If your goal is documentation that is correct and detailed, then the folklore contained in a turnip's brain is your holy grail. But they're not naturally inclined to document things, and because they're busy doing important work, your documentation process may need to be altered to accommodate them. This is generally worth doing in my experience. To get those docs out of them, first, you need to reframe documentation for them. Changing perspectives, looking at things in a new way or from a new angle can be powerful in changing behavior. If, as a turnip, docs feel either irrelevant and unnecessary or even like cheat guides for posers, avoidance of them is instinctual, and changing that attitude could be very difficult. But let's remember our purpose. We're not necessarily trying to get turnips to read documentation here. We're trying to get them to help create it. So since knowledge and mastery is the motivation for turnips, framing the act of docs creation as a skill, as a domain that they can attain mastery of, is likely to be more effective than just extolling the virtues or necessity of documentation more generally. Docs can also be a way for turnips to, in effect, show off their expertise to others, proving that they are in fact knowledgeable. And perhaps most effectively, showing that good documentation can be used to reduce interruptions in their life from lesser beings can be very effective. This is a broader cultural piece because it will only be convincing if it's actually true. That means that there either needs to be an organizational expectation that it's appropriate to send users to the docs first before escalating users to turnip, and or you need to increase the scope of what your support workers are permitted to do for users with the support of turnip-written docs. I've seen pushback to both of these strategies, but I've also seen some pretty significant successes as a result of them, and there's usually room for at least incremental improvement on these. You'll also want to support turnips' writing efforts. Reduce the barriers that stand in their way. Turnips who know a lot don't actually know what other people don't know. And if left to their own devices and forced to document something, they may not make the best choices about what needs to be documented. So if you can identify and prioritize what's needed and be direct and explicit when asking for it, this will go a long way. We need to tell the developers using our product how to turn on a new feature and resolve any conflicts, and we should include a working code sample is going to be way more effective than, hey, could you document that new feature? Provide templates, once again, and then help with the publishing and curation and management part. The information these folks know is useful and necessary, but it's organized in a different way in their heads than it might need to be for your docs audience. This means that at least some of the time you may also need to edit and rewrite some of their documentation for the users. Finally, we all get to choose the hills we are willing to die on, but I'd suggest that winning the fight on consistent use of the Oxford comma with a turnip is not a good use of your time, especially if it prevents them from getting what they know out in an accessible form. Next, Kale. How does Kale relate to documentation? It really depends on how it fits into what they're trying to achieve. Because remember, achieving things is what Kale loves best. This means that if documentation is part of the criteria that will be used for evaluating the success of a project, it will be a priority for them. Otherwise, they won't. As a documenter, Kales are often opportunists. They happily reuse or repurpose existing documentation, which can be positive or negative, depending on quality. Kale is into big bang launches because that's where the accolades are, but not so much into incremental improvement or long-term maintenance and support. As documenters, Kales are inconsistent in my experience, though they usually love using it themselves. How to support Kale? Well, first, you could try literally gamifying documentation for them. One way to do that is to post the stats on who's doing the doc writing, at least internally. Who wrote the most or most visited article this week, this month, this year? Who has the greatest proportion of current reviewed docs, and so on. Kale likes to have their name in lights, so maybe consider having the author of docs visible in some fashion, although I admit that this is maybe not desirable in all circumstances. Of course, the biggest gamification strategy I'd suggest is to not let writing documentation be an optional side quest. Having all needed docs in place before launch needs to be a critical success criteria in your projects. It needs to be a standard element in your release plan or project plan. There's probably a whole other half-hour talk contained in that one bullet, I acknowledge. But a big part of achieving this is having a good understanding of what your actual documentation needs and expectations are, and ensuring they're in proportion to the need and the resources available and maintainable over time. If folks are failing to meet documentation expectations, they may just need more of the supports I'm talking about here. But if they're not even trying to meet documentation expectations, then it's also possible that those expectations are either non-existent or, alternatively, inappropriately complex and unmanageable. Finally, public kudos are important. Thank them in front of others, especially in front of the folks whose judgments matter to their careers or other projects. Once you have them concerned with documentation, you need to support Kale's achievement. If they're doing an adventure survival race, you're one of the folks at the camp setting up the tent and making sure they have dry socks ready. One piece of advice I would offer is to be available on short notice. Where I work, I know that about a week or up to 3 weeks before the launch date of the major project, Kale is going to come to me and ask me to edit and publish their 15 docs. I could quite reasonably tell them to organize their work better and that their poor planning is not my crisis, but the reality is that that likely won't change this behavior. Accommodating them now gets me their gratitude and further commitment to documentation in the future. And actually does make it more likely that they'll give me more notice also. Once again, templates are great. Achievers will use them, and it'll make your short notice rush job easier to get through. But if I can offer a word of caution, Kales are fans of big bang launches of new and exciting things. So if you're not careful, you can end up with them wanting to create a new place for just their docs with every launch. If there was one place to prioritize using your influence, it's definitely in asserting that their docs go in the established, expected, existing place with all the other docs, though you can certainly sweeten the deal by agreeing to highlight them in some fashion. Also, if you can outsource the maintenance of their docs to others, perhaps Sprouts, you may save yourself many a headache in the future. I just wanted to take a moment here to talk a little bit more about templates. As I've mentioned, templates can be useful for almost everyone, but I'm sure most of you are already using templates in your work. You might want to consider, however, whether you could actually use them more extensively and more purposefully. One of the advantages of creating more specific templates is that it makes it easier for others to take advantage of your work and integrate it into project plans. For example, we recently created a new template for a support desk cheat sheet. This is a template. It includes all of the at-a-glance info that a support desk worker might need about a service offering, links to all of the docs, the names of the groups or individuals who can provide Tier 2 support, and a troubleshooting section. And this template, which I developed in consultation with the new support desk lead analyst, is now part of the project plan for launching any new or updated service to our community. It supports our Sprouts, it gives guidance to the turnips on what information is actually needed, and is a good showpiece for a Kale. I highly recommend looking for this kind of opportunity to create and use and improve templates in your work, even if you think you're already in a good place with this. I also recommend that you manage and maintain your blank templates with the rest of your documentation. Hey, Broccoli. Don't worry, I haven't forgotten about you. Back to Broccoli. I'm going to suggest that in addition to their other difficult traits, broccolis are often predictably terrible at documentation. Not because of lack of ability, but because information is power. So controlling information is also power. If something is well documented, it makes it possible for others to avoid broccoli's influence. For example, if broccoli is in charge of the weird legacy software that your organization inexplicably still depends on, possibly written in COBOL, it will likely be pretty badly documented because then everybody has to go through broccoli. Paradoxically, however, if broccolis haven't managed to consolidate sole ownership of the technology, or if documentation is considered laudatory in your workplace, broccoli may be motivated to occasionally add to the existing documentation when doing so lets them show a coworker up in front of others. I promise you, however, that they will never ever review or update it, ever. Broccolis are inconsistent documenters and elements of destructive chaos. They are also, not to put too fine a point on it, bullies. Well, maybe I was avoiding dealing with broccoli for a moment there with my digression about templates, but I shouldn't have. And that's actually part of my advice to you. I sincerely hope you're not having to deal with broccolis, but if you are, then deal with them. Avoiding addressing the problem only makes it worse in this case. If you must work with a suspected broccoli, then player type theory does suggest a few strategies you can use. First, you want to protect yourself and other vulnerable members of the team. Not just because these strategies can help with actually getting documentation done, they potentially can, but because, and I'm not joking now, work matters. Your experience of it matters, and you're worth protecting. So only talk to broccolis in public. Don't let them collar you in a quiet hallway or one-on-one Zoom meeting and make commitments for which there are no witnesses. Document everything. If you do have a verbal conversation about a project, follow up with an email in which you reiterate what everyone committed to. It's dangerous out there because of broccoli, so don't go alone. Have allies who also know what's going on with this person if you are a primary target, and check in with your colleagues about how they're doing. I think this is particularly important when working fully remote, as so many of us are now, because so much more of our work life is invisible to each other. And in particular, as regards allies, Bartle suggests that explorers are the natural enemy of killers, so get a turnip involved. They know enough to keep broccolis in line and to pierce through their lies. If broccoli's behavior is nearing or crossing the line of professionalism and collegiality, talk to your manager or team lead about what you're seeing and support it with data. Then you need to go forward with documentation projects as though it were completely reasonable to do so. Too often, workplace bullies are permitted to act with impunity because people would rather accept their bad behavior and avoid conflict than acknowledge how damaging it is. But if you are able to confront it, you need to do it safely. Even though everything isn't normal, you should still act in public as though it was. What I mean by that is treat the commitments they make as though they're real and be surprised in public if they don't fulfill them. Follow up in writing and in public on commitments they've made and expect accountability. Escalate the problem to someone with more power than you if you need to. And if you are someone with more power, it's incredibly toxic for you to ignore someone's bad behavior. If there's a pattern of concern being expressed by the people in your team, this needs to be addressed one way or another. Don't ignore it just because the broccoli you know seems different than the one that is being reported to you. Privately expect delays and power plays, but don't tolerate them or engage with them. And address the problem. If people on your team tell you there's a problem, believe them and properly investigate it. I don't want to be totally negative here, so I'll also say this. Not all broccolis are what they appear to be. Some broccolis are broccolis right down to their roots, if you will, but I suspect that at least a few of the apparent broccolis you encounter are redeemable, and there's something more than simple survival at stake. Let me be clear, I'm not advocating that you ever put up with outright abuse or harassment and let those things slide. But sometimes a person who appears to be a broccoli might actually be a twisted version of their former turnip, kale, or sprout self. They act the way they act because of frustration and cynicism, because of a lack of ability to navigate the system usefully, because they think it's the only way to get things done, because they think the importance of the work justifies their behavior, and so on. But unlike a true broccoli, they actually care about more than just their own power and importance. If you can empower them to use their killer instincts on behalf of the project against delays and barriers rather than against their coworkers, you might just do everyone a huge favor. If you're up for the attempt, and you don't have to be, but if you are, then here's some words of advice. First, many of us have discomfort with conflict and with anger, and this can make it hard to be around people who seem angry. So if you can, try temporarily interpreting apparent hostility as a sign of how much they actually care about the thing. This can transform your impression of the person and make it easier to listen to them. And that's the second thing. Even if you think you've heard it all before, even if you think you understand the grievance or objection thoroughly, try to really listen to them. Hear them out. Use active listening skills like reflecting back what you're hearing, paraphrasing, summarizing, checking your understanding with them, and so on. There's a big difference between hearing someone and them experiencing having been heard. Few of us are truly reassured by someone telling us, I've heard what you have to say, especially if we're in distress. It's a lot more convincing if you can hear them explain your problem to you in a way that shows real understanding of it. Be willing to acknowledge real barriers and problems. If someone is in distress about a problem, they know it enough to know it is a real problem. It doesn't reassure them to be told it's fine. They already know it's not fine. All it does is lose you their respect. So don't sugarcoat it. If it's bad, and the most reassuring thing is to know that someone else knows it's bad too. And then work together to identify a path forward and enact it. If they truly are a broccoli to their very roots, you'll figure this out in this process. But if they just went a bit broccoli accidentally because of circumstances, this is where transformation can happen. And I honestly wish you all the luck. So that's my talk. Here's the TLDR. Documentation is great and will solve all our problems. Citation needed. Applying academic theory to your work can offer interesting insights and also be fun. And crucifers are tasty. But more importantly, support and advocate for sprouts. They are great and naturally are on side with documentation. Reframe documentation for turnips, then support their writing of it, making it as painless as you can. It's worth doing. Gamify documentation for kales and, no pressure. Successfully advocate for documentation as critical success criteria. And finally, protect yourself and others from broccolis and don't normalize their bad behavior. Thank you so much. I look forward to answering your questions in the Q&A, and please contact me anytime if you want to explore these ideas more. And thank you again to the organizers. It's always a great conference. Thanks.
Well, hey everyone, thanks for coming over to Q&A with Kenzie here. Kenzie, great presentation. I really love the take on vegetables as personas. It's so good. And it makes me hungry though. That's a problem. It's time for lunch here.
Oh well.
It's good. So let's go and have a look at some of the questions that have been asked. I think we haven't seen as many questions this time around. I think that's just credit to you and the fact that your presentation was had so many good takeaways from it. So I think we can pull some together here. So there's a couple of questions here that seem related. So I'll ask them one at a time, and
sure.
We'll see if it makes sense. So it seems like templates seem to underpin quite a bit how successful you'll be in your traversing through the dungeon. But it sounds like that might have been something that you discovered along the way in your journey. When did you sort of make the connection that templates form a pretty crucial part to a lot of this sort of thing?
I can't take credit for this insight. The person who, started our knowledge base originally started it with a set of 5 templates, and then I just used them a lot for many years. But once I started thinking about, once I had more responsibility for that, instead of just being a contributor, being a person who was administering it, who was trying to get people into doing it, it just became so clear that if you have a good template and you put it consistently in front of people over and over and over again, it can really help to shape the information that they give you, because otherwise people don't know how to write, it turns out, unless that's their job. And some folks will use them a lot more easily than others, but it became a really clear thing over time. And then, as I say, recently we've been looking at, how can we make different templates, and how can it helps us to standardize our processes in all sorts of ways. And so, I don't know, it's not new, and it's not something I came up with, but it's, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think you're right on there. It's like the whole blank page paralysis problem is really prevalent, isn't it? When we're trying to get contributions to docs in all those different persona types. So having something to start with, even if just a couple of headings on the page, really does make a big difference, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And people, often, especially turnips, will just sort of launch into the very middle of a thing, unless you give them a section that says introductory paragraph, tell us what it is that is important, what have you. If you don't put that in there, they're just like, look, you just look at this property and you do this thing and then you're done. And you're like,
yeah.
Or Yeah.
Let's start with the why. Like, why would I want to read this page to start with? Let's just circle back to that. Yeah, exactly right. No, having that structure is really, really good. I was speaking of turnips. In the case of that elusive turnip, what do you think about meeting them halfway by using them as sort of like knowledge resources, but writing the documentation yourself, almost like a medium, if you like?
Yeah, I do that a lot. I actually find that meeting them more than halfway can help you to get them to come and meet you halfway later, if that makes sense. So I have gone and people who have been harassed for some time, well, where is this documented, this thing you keep telling me about? And they're like, oh, it's not anywhere. And if I go to them and I say, look, let's sit down, you'll show me the thing, I'll write it down, and then you can edit it. If I do that a few times, after a while, they're like, look, I wrote a thing. I know it's not the way you would want it to be for the thing, but it's a starting place. And then they're just like giving it to me in that, here's the information. But that's fine. But if I don't go and like meet them quite a bit further than halfway, I think in some cases, that's the starting point. That's building that relationship so that then they'll, turn around and they know that they can trust me not to show them up and, make them look bad and that sort of thing. Relationship building is at the heart of everything we do. So
absolutely. Yeah. It does really take a village to make great documentation. So, having all these different, each one of these personalities, even, the broccoli in some respects too, while they're, they are a certain type of personality, like they do form a part of the larger sort of contribution base that you can sometimes get. You just have to tread carefully, right? It seems with the broccoli.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's very true. So with regard to templates, do you have like a broad outline of what the template sort of looks like? I know we sort of touched on a little bit before about, having sort of like a structure to it, but what if you were to describe it, how do you think it would look?
Well, so when I write a template, because one of the systems that we're using has the ability to create a copy of a document with one click. And so then they can just replace any of the text as they go. I just write them up where, I'll say title of the document in title case, and that's the title of the template. Title of the how-to document in title case, but I say in title case because that's the standard, what have you. And then the first heading is introductory paragraph, and then the paragraph that is there is a description of what it should include, and then then it's a very meta document, if that makes sense. So the structure is all there so they can see it, and then it's all describing and all the instructions are right there, and they just highlight it and replace it with their text, and away we go.
Right. So you definitely have that sort of like help text, or like the broad strokes of what they need to cover right there in the template, so they don't have to sort of refer out to another document, for example, and see what they need to write.
Yeah. And with this tool that we're using to manage our documentation internally, there's a whole bunch of sort of advanced features that they don't know how to use, but I've put them into the document already. And so, there's an automatic table of contents. It's not that complicated, but it's not, they don't know about it, and they don't know to use it, and they don't know to navigate the menus to find it. But if it's already in there and it's just going to work, then away we go, right? Like I just lay it out exactly the way it should be and make it as clear as I possibly can.
Sounds like Templates 101.
Templates are a kind of documentation.
Yeah, that's right.
So,
yeah, absolutely. That's Templates 101 right there. So I think we might be getting towards the end of the Q&A. These things always go so fast when we're talking about things after the show. But if you had to personally identify with one of the veggie personas, which one do you think it'd be, Kenzie?
Well, I am here using what power and influence I have to try and control your actions. So maybe I'm a broccoli. We all don't know.
Contentious.
I'm kidding. Contentious. I think I'm fundamentally a bit of a sprout. I'm a very helper people-oriented person, but I think you have to be all of them at various points. You have to understand all of them. That's the user empathy piece, is to be able to relate to as many folks as possible.
Yeah, so that's actually probably a pretty good insight right there. I think you sort of almost do have to bridge between a number of personas as a writer, don't you, when you're actually trying to get in the heads of your audience. So yeah, I think we might be having to take a number of hats and put them on, or a number of different salad dressings, however you like to look at it. All right.
Well, that's a better one.
You can take that.
Thank you. Okay.
Okay. Well, folks, that's probably a wrap for the Q&A sessions for Kenzie. Thanks again, Kenzie, for coming in. It's been wonderful having a chat with you and listening to your thoughts.